7 days. That's how long Israel's strategic fuel reserves last under wartime consumption rates. 7 days until every car stops moving, every military vehicle runs out of diesel, every aircraft sits grounded, every hospital backup generator goes silent, and every truck carrying food to supermarkets becomes a useless piece of metal blocking the road. And the countdown started 36 hours ago when Iranian Khaybar-Shikan missiles hit the Haifa oil refinery. Not damaged it, not degraded its capacity, destroyed it. The refinery that processes 100% of Israel's gasoline, 100% of its diesel, 100% of its jet fuel, and 100% of its heating oil is gone. Not Israel's largest refinery. Israel's only refinery. The single facility that turns imported crude oil into usable fuel that keeps Israeli civilization functioning is now a burning wreck on the Mediterranean coast. And there is no backup. There is no alternative facility. There is no neighboring country that will allow fuel shipments to transit their territory into a war zone. There is no shipping company that will send tankers loaded with refined fuel into Israeli ports while Iranian missiles are falling. 7 days. Then the fuel runs out. Then everything stops. Israel does not produce oil. This is not a minor detail. This is the foundational vulnerability of the entire Israeli economy and military. Israel imports 100% of its crude oil, primarily from Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and West African producers who ship through the Mediterranean. The crude arrives at Israeli ports, gets transported to the Haifa refinery, and gets processed into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, kerosene, and other petroleum products that modern civilization requires to function. Without the refinery, the crude oil sitting in Israeli storage tanks is useless. You cannot put crude oil in your car. You cannot power a tank with unrefined petroleum. You cannot fly an F-35 on crude. The refining process is what transforms the raw material into usable fuel. And that process happened in exactly one place, Haifa, the facility that Iranian missiles just reduced to wreckage that will take 18 months minimum to rebuild, even if the war ended tomorrow. The Haifa refinery had a processing capacity of 9 million tons per year, which translates to roughly 197,000 barrels per day. In wartime, Israel consumes approximately 250,000 barrels per day of refined petroleum products. Under normal peacetime conditions, Israel imports the difference between what Haifa produces and what the country consumes. But these are not normal peacetime conditions. These are conditions where the refinery is destroyed, where shipping companies refuse to deliver to Israeli ports, where neighboring countries will not allow fuel trucks to transit their borders, and where the only fuel available is what exists in strategic reserve tanks right now. The Israeli government maintains strategic petroleum reserves as a buffer against supply disruptions. Those reserves, according to International Energy Agency requirements, are supposed to cover 90 days of normal consumption. But wartime consumption is not normal consumption. Military operations, emergency services running constantly, civilians stockpiling fuel in panic, transportation networks operating at maximum capacity, trying to evacuate populations and move supplies, all of that burns fuel at rates that peacetime planning never anticipated. The 90-day reserve becomes a 7-day reserve when the consumption rate triples and the resupply stops. Let's be very specific about what happens when the fuel runs out, because this is not an abstraction, and it's not something that affects just the military or the government. This affects every single person in Israel in ways that are immediate, visceral, and civilization-ending. Day 1, after fuel depletion, private vehicles stop. Israel has 3.5 million registered vehicles. The moment gas stations run dry, those vehicles become stationary obstacles. People cannot drive to work, cannot drive to hospitals, cannot evacuate if ordered. The roads that were congested become parking lots of abandoned cars that ran out of fuel mid-journey. Day 2, public transportation stops, buses, trains that run on diesel locomotives, emergency services that depend on fuel, all offline. The 9 million people in Israel who need to move to survive, to get food, to reach medical care, have no transportation network. Day 3, hospitals lose backup power. Israeli hospitals run on electricity from the national grid with diesel generators as backup for when the grid fails. When the generators run out of fuel, hospitals operating on grid power alone lose the ability to handle the inevitable grid failures that happen during war. Patients on ventilators die. Surgical suites go dark. Refrigerated medication spoils. Day 4, food distribution collapses. Israel imports 90% of its grain, significant portions of its fruits and vegetables, and almost all of its meat. That food arrives at ports, gets loaded onto trucks, and gets distributed to supermarkets and grocery stores across the country. When the trucks stop running, the food stops moving. Supermarkets in Tel Aviv are not going to receive shipments from the port. Rural communities are not going to receive deliveries from central distribution warehouses. The food supply chain that feeds 9 million people is entirely dependent on diesel fuel for trucks. No fuel means no food movement. The grocery store is empty in 48 hours. After that, hunger starts. Not in some theoretical future scenario. in the here and now, in one of the most economically developed countries in the world, because the logistics network that prevents starvation runs on fuel that no longer exists. Day 5, the military becomes partially immobilized. The Israeli Defense Forces operate thousands of armored vehicles, transport trucks, and aircraft. All of them require fuel. The IDF maintains its own strategic reserves separate from civilian reserves, but those reserves are also finite and also being consumed at wartime rates. When military fuel runs low, commanders have to make choices about which units get fuel and which units stay parked. Tanks that could respond to threats sit idle because moving them burns fuel that might be needed for a more critical mission tomorrow. Aircraft that could provide air support stay grounded because the jet fuel remaining has to be reserved for the most essential defensive missions. The military that was supposed to protect Israel from external threats becomes hobbled by an internal resource constraint that no amount of training or technology can solve. Day 6, electricity generation starts failing. Israel's power plants run on natural gas, coal,